Okay, welcome. And thank you for joining us for this, this first in a series of digital workshop talks that the O'Donnell Institute is holding over the course of the fall semester. I'm Sarah Koslowski. I'm the Associate Director of the O'Donnell Institute, and I'm honored to welcome our speaker, Jacqueline Chao. Before I introduce her, I would invite you to turn off your cameras and mics if they aren't off already, everyone except Jacqueline. And I would invite Jacqueline to share her screen. We'll all come back on screen at the end of the talk for conversation. Jacqueline Chao is Senior Curator of Asian Art at the Crow Museum of Asian Art at UT Dallas. A specialist in Chinese and Buddhist art, Dr. Chao holds an MA and PhD in the History and Theory of Art from Arizona State University. Her curated exhibitions, many curated exhibitions, have presented works ranging from the historical to the contemporary, which is one of the things I find most interesting about Jacqueline's work, in a range of medias from emerging and established artists from across the globe. Her recently curated exhibitions include Belly Lu, One and Another, 2020, Hands and Earth, Contemporary Japanese Ceramics, 2019, Future Retrospective, Master Shenlong, 2019, Jacob Hashimoto, Clouds and Chaos, 2018, Invisible Cities, Moving Images Asia from 2017, Hidden Nature from 2017, and Landscape Relativities from 2017. She's curated and organized over 20 exhibitions at the Crow, as well as the Phoenix Art Museum, the ASU Art Museum, the ASU Institute for Humanities Research, the Chicago Artists Coalition, and the University of Toronto Art Center. Today, we'll have a talk from her that goes back to a topic that grows out of her dissertation research, if I understand correctly, and it's called Dragons and Dragon Kings in Chinese painting. So please welcome me join me in welcoming Jacqueline Chao.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Koslowski, for such a warm introduction. And first of all, I do wish to thank Dr. Thomas and Dr. Koslowski, as well as Heather Bowling and the Edith O'Donnell Institute for Art History for inviting me to present my research today. I also really wish to express my thanks to all the attendees for being here to hear me present. Oh, I was moving one slide forward. My presentation today is based on an article I recently published as part of an edited volume of research essays on Buddhisms in Asia, traditions, transmissions, and transformations. The research is ongoing as the topic of Chinese dragons and dragon kings is quite massive, with still more to uncover. So I am interested in hearing everyone's thoughts. The Chinese dragon, or long, is a unique composite creature in Chinese art and culture, a symbol strongly associated with supernatural transformation, political authority, and divine will. Traditionally linked with water, rainfall, clouds, and thunder since Neolithic times, early folkloric Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian associations with the dragon further contributed to the development of the creature's auspicious interpretation and visualization. Today, I will begin my presentation with a discussion on the various roles of the Chinese dragon in Chinese art and culture and its early aesthetic development. I will then focus on the interesting development of the Dragon King in Chinese Buddhism and Buddhist art. And in early Chinese Buddhist mythology, the dragon serves as one of the 8 protectors of the Dharma. And we find that the Sanskrit terms for Naga and nāgarāja, serpent-like creatures in early Indian mythology, that play prominent roles in early Indian Buddhist texts, were translated as Chinese dragon Long and dragon king Long Wang, respectively. By highlighting a few Chinese artworks that include illustration of the Chinese dragon king as influenced by the transmission of Buddhism from India to China, it is hoped that my presentation today will illuminate the unique role of the Chinese dragon and dragon king in Chinese Buddhism, as well as explore the transformation of its image. Unlike other scaly insects or other real-world animals, the Chinese dragon is a supernatural beast that has been imagined, mythologized, divinized, and spiritualized a symbol strongly associated with imperial power and supernatural transformation. As such, from ancient times until now, the dragon's painted representation has remained popular and undergone many developments in terms of its visual form. Dragons and dragon-like creatures play prominent roles in Chinese folklore and mythology, and perhaps the most common mythical animals mentioned in ancient texts. Dragons appear in the mythological Huang, or Yellow Emperor's reign, who flourished in the 26th century BCE. The Yellow Emperor is more understood as a mythical god than a real ruler of the prehistoric Chinese nation. He is included among the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, a group of mythological rulers or god kings in ancient China who used their abilities to help create mankind and impart essential skills and knowledge. The 3 sovereigns, or 3 august ones, are generally referred to as Fuxi, Numa, Shennong, and the 5 emperors were referred to as the Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, Zuanshu, Emperor Ku, Emperor Yao, and Emperor Sun. Fuxi was the mythical creator of fishing and trapping, Nua was the mythical creator of humans, and Shennong was the mythical creator of agriculture. Fuxi is also said to have been responsible for having devised a record-keeping system of knotted cords, which was also most famously known, and also was most famously known for creating the 8 trigrams, or bagua, which were and are still used for divinatory purposes as described in the Book of Changes, or Yi Jing. In creating the bagua, the 8 hexagrams, Fuxi tried to bring all things in heaven and earth into a simple system of notation by developing 8 combinations of trigrams to represent heaven, earth, thunder, wind, water, fire, mountains, and rivers, respectively. Possibly one of the earliest written descriptions of dragons appears in the early divination text of the I Ching in describing the lines of the hexagram tian, or heaven, where the appearance of the hexagram was interpreted as following the natural movements of a dragon. In the text of the I Ching, each of the 8 trigrams is represented as a hexagram of 6 horizontal lines, and some lines are undivided and some lines are divided, referred to as yang and yin and yang, right, lines respectively. And the Qian hexagram typically consists of 6 undivided yang lines to symbolize heaven, and the interpretation of the hexagram was based on the dragon's actions, where the dragon is chosen to stand as both superior man and vital breath. So some examples here from the I Ching of different readings of the hexagram, Qian hexagram, if it was read. So in this case, if you were in a particular format, you could say the dragon is in concealment, not the time for active doing or rash action. The dragon in the abyss is about to leap, but is not yet in action. The dragon appears in the fields. It is advantageous to see a great man. So it'll be favorable at this, is divining that it'll be favorable that you'll meet a great person or a person in a powerful position. Or the dragon flying at extreme height results in regret. So don't shoot too high in your actions. So these are the kind of, again, using the dragon as the center point. According to legend, the mythical Fuxi, while reading the Hetu, or the Yellow River chart, on the back of a mythical longma, which literally means dragon horse, a fabled winged horse with dragon scales that emerged out of the Luo River, used the chart to draw out the arrangement of the 8 trigrams. As the story goes, the water sent forth a dragon horse, and on its back there was a curly hair, like a map of starry dots. The water sent forth a divine tortoise, and on its back there were ribbon veins, like the writing of character pictures. This Hetu, or Yellow River chart, is alternatively named the Longtu and Matu, literally meaning dragon chart and horse chart, respectively. Its number is related to the original formation of heaven and earth. This Hetu has served as the foundation for the study of astrology, combinations of yin and yang, and the 5 elements, as well as the practice of feng shui and tai chi. So I note here that I have included this painting of a later 13th century painting by Ma Yuan of Fuxi, and I just wanted to include it because you'll note the 8 trigrams that are at his feet, and also a tortoise, which again alludes to this specific story. A variety of early historical sources, ranging from Buddhist, Taoist, folkloric, and mythological texts, have connected the appearance of Chinese dragons with rainfall, where images of the Chinese dragon were incorporated into rain invocation rituals in order to ensure good harvest. Alvin Cohen has surveyed a selection of ancient Chinese ritual and magical rainmaking methods as found in a variety of Chinese texts dating from the 2nd century BCE through to the Qing dynasty, so into 1640 to the 17th and early 20th century. According to Cohen, while rainmaking rituals were mentioned in earlier texts, the earliest in-depth description of the ritual of rainmaking was in the luxuriant dew of the spring and autumn annals, or Cunqiu Fanlu, attributed to Dong Dongshu, a prominent Han Dynasty Confucian scholar known for his cosmological theories and performance of rainmaking rituals. In his review and identification of the most common rainmaking ritual procedural elements, Cohen notes that prayers for rain were dedicated to local cult deities, oftentimes dragons, who were believed to control the weather. The supplicant would make a clay image or painting of the rain-producing dragon deity, or a cloth or paper image on a bamboo frame, thus encapsulating the deity's potency. Prayers for rain would then be made directly to the image or the painting. And in addition, a rain dance was performed, where the image was carried during the dance. If necessary, the supplicant, or shaman, was also placed naked under the sun in an effort to activate the dragon's sympathy, and therefore coerce it to create rain and alleviate the supplicant's bodily suffering. Altars were erected at the site, offerings of food and alcohol were made, and that the size, number, and color of the clay dragons were arranged in a very specific order based upon the occasions of the year. The most important sutra recited and followed in these rain ceremonies was the Mahamegha Sutra, or Sutra of the Great Cloud, that was translated first by Gupta in 557 to 581 CE, and was a second time translated later in 589 to 618 CE. So over time, the practice for rain invocation continued to evolve. In the Tang Dynasty, paintings of dragons in temples dedicated to worship of the dragon were used as tools for prayers for rain, indicated as follows. According to the miscellaneous records of the Emperor Ming Huang, who is actually Xuanzong, a severe drought hit the central Shanxi area around Chang'an during the Kaiyuan period. Emperor Xuanzong sent his ministers to the mountains, forests, lakes, and marshes to pray for rain, but nothing happened. A hall was then built by the dragon pond in the palace, and Feng Shaozhen, a painter of dragons, was summoned to paint a dragon on each of the 4 inside walls of the hall. Before the dragons were half finished, winds and clouds rose with the painter's brush, the scales of the dragons became wet, and one of the dragons that had not yet been colored in came down from the wall and dived into the pond. In a moment, the sky became overcast and a pelting rain poured down, relieving the Chang'an area from drought. So late Ming Dynasty emperors also performed prayers for rain in times of drought. We are told, for example, that during a drought at the time of Emperor Xianzong, during the Ming Dynasty, he was active from 1465 to 1487, all the Buddhist monks and Taoist priests of Songshan gathered in front of the Dragon King to pray for rain. And the tradition of offering imperial sacrifice and prayers for rain continued through to the end of the Qing Dynasty and was fervently practiced. The Qing emperors conducted prayers for rain within the precincts of the altar to heaven. Prayers were performed by the Kangxi Emperor in 1671, in 1678, in 1679, in 1680, in 1687, in 1689, and 1717, and so on and so forth. In Evelyn Roski's study of Qing Dynasty emperors and their activities, she notes the frequent occurrence of imperial mandated practice and performance of Buddhist and Taoist rain invocation rituals at times simultaneously. So for example, during a period of drought, an imperial memoriam from 1783 ordered 9 monks to chant the Great Cloud Sutra for 7 continuous days and sent imperial princes at the same time to pray for rain at a Taoist altar. The right to rule in early Chinese civilization was strongly connected to one's ability to invoke the dragon. From as far back as the Shang dynasty, Chinese rule and kingly virtue became inextricably linked with prayers for rain, as noted from the following example. From the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE, stories circulated about a 7-year drought that began after the Tang dynasty, after Tang, the founder of the Shang dynasty, killed the last ruler of the preceding Xia dynasty. So when the gods of the mountains and rivers demanded a human sacrifice, Tang prayed to the deity that controlled the rain, Shangdi, announcing his willingness to take the burden of wrongdoing on his own person and to become the sacrifice. Heaven then responded with great rain. During the Han dynasty, the appearance of the dragon became directly connected to the emperor and imperial rule, from tales connecting dragons to the birth of Liu Bang, or Emperor Gao, who was the founder of the Han dynasty. By association, visions of sightings of dragons came to be considered as auspicious omens and perceived as signs of heavenly favor. Clearly, the visual representation of dragons persisted from the Yuan dynasty and was widespread in Ming and Qing dynasty court art and decorative arts, coming to symbolize the emperor himself and further developed as an imperial symbol. Ordinary dress for the emperor was commonly referred to as the dragon robe, made of yellow satin and embroidered with dragon patterns and pheasant designs, as seen here in these Qing dynasty imperial portraits, all of them in succession, from Kangxi, the grandfather, Yongzhen, the father, to Qianlong, the successor, son. In terms of dress, there was a hierarchy of 9 types of dragons, of which the highest, the 5-clawed dragon, was prominently featured in the emperor's court robes. And the right to wear robes decorated with these 9 5-clawed dragons was restricted only to the emperor, his sons and princes in the 1st and 2nd ranks. From the Song dynasty, the dragon became the symbol of the emperor, and by convention refers to the emperor's person. His body was the dragon body, his hands the claws, his capital the dragon's pool. The Song, Liao, Jing, and Yuan dynasties forbade subjects to wear robes with dragon patterns, but the dragon symbolism did not simply isolate the emperor from everyone else. There was a hierarchy of types, of which the highest, the 5-clawed, was featured on the emperor. 4-clawed would then appear on the robes of his brothers who held princely ranks. The dragons topped the seals of rank presented to emperors and empresses and consorts. And the dragon was known as the son of heaven, or Tianzi. An alternative title for the Chinese emperor is Zhenlong Tianzi, or true dragon and son of heaven. As the true dragon, the emperor is considered superior to less true dragons, such as the legendary and local dragon kings, with the power to influence dragons and invoke rainfall. The tradition of offering imperial sacrifice and prayers for rain in times of drought continued through to the end of the Qing and was fervently practiced in times of drought in an effort to secure imperial authority. An example is a particular incident in the Qianlong Emperor's reign during a famine year. And this is a portrait of Emperor Qianlong. In the 1744, rain still did not come despite Qianlong's multiple efforts to invoke rain. And the situation was so dire that it caused the Empress Dowager to walk from her palace to the dragon god temple in the villa grounds to devoutly pray. Qianlong's personal writings regarding the situation record the guilt he felt for being so unvirtuous, or Buddha, and being unable to summon heaven's harmony, particularly as the son of heaven. Thus, the tradition of offering imperial sacrifice and prayers for rain in times of drought and the persona and authority of the emperor was greatly imbued with the ability to be able to invoke the dragon. And in addition to the dragon serving as symbol of imperial rule, the sight of a Chinese dragon continued to bear great protective meaning and was particularly included in all aspects of decorative design. We note the presence of the coiling dragon motif as a dominant design on ceilings of traditional Chinese architectural interiors and exterior roofs. These other dragon-like creatures are representative of not only the dragon itself, but also of the dragon's kin. According to legend, the dragon is said to have 9 sons. The dragon's 9 sons each displayed typical dragon-like features. However, each of them are distinguished by different attributes, functions, and manifestations. And designs were often used to decorate the eaves, ridges, balustrades, and terrace bases of ancient Chinese buildings, weapons, and vessels. And many temples dedicated to the worship of dragons were built throughout history. Sun Nikan's study of temples in Beijing from 1400 to 1900 lists at least 64 different temples dedicated to dragon kings during this period in Beijing alone. One such temple is the Black Dragon Pool Temple, erected in 1681 at a site on Gold Mountain, over 30 li to the northwest of the capital city, because the dragon god there was said to be particularly efficacious. This is an image actually of another famous black dragon pool in Lijiang, and it's believed that a dragon resides in it. In different periods of Chinese history, the classical philosophies of Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism coexisted peacefully and harmoniously. And Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian association with the Chinese dragon have further contributed to the dragon's auspicious interpretation and visualization. In Taoism, we see the dragon as the vehicle of the immortals. And in Confucianism, we find the dragon equated with that of the ideal gentleman. The Taoist philosopher Zhang described the heavenly land of the immortals, with the dragon considered the symbol of the yang force and of the Tao, serving as the vehicle of the gods. The ascension of Huang, the Yellow Emperor, as described in Sima Chen's records of the historian, compiled in 104 BCE, was being quite grand. A dragon with whiskers hanging from its chin came down from the sky to fetch him. The Yellow Emperor mounted on the dragon's back, followed by his ministers and palace ladies, making a company of over 70 persons. When they had all mounted, the dragon rose from the ground and departed. This concept of immortality in relation to riding dragons was visually portrayed early on. Here we see the earliest surviving example of a painted dragon on a silk funerary banner that was excavated from a tomb in Changsha, Hunan, dated to the late Warring States period. The banner portrays a male figure dressed in official robes riding a dragon. And to the viewer's left corner, you can see the painting of a fish to indicate that the dragon is possibly flying above water. And as a funerary banner, this image is possibly of the deceased soul's journey into the afterlife, as well as a painted portrait of the deceased. A later painted example of Taoist immortals riding dragons are found in the Song dynasty, as seen as in this painting by Ma Yuan of an immortal riding a dragon. And of this particular painting, by riding the dragon, the adept demonstrated the transcendence of their earthbound existence. In this painting, the immortal is shown flying through the air on the back of a dragon against a background of clouds, from which a dragon has just emerged. Concurrently, the dragon becomes a symbol of the Tao itself, as well as the rejuvenating yang force as it rises out of the ocean, bringing water to the earth. So Taoists developed the theory of yin and yang as two opposing forces or cosmic influences and fluctuations, as well as adopted the theory of the 5 elements. Understanding the 8 trigrams, the forces of yin and yang, played a role in chemical alchemy, for it was believed that successful manipulation of these forces would result in a pill or elixir of immortality. The dragon and tiger together signified a balance of yin and yang, where the tiger represented the dragon's opposite, and where together the motif signified an alchemical balance of the 2 forces. And this is related to the tale of the first Taoist celestial master, Zhang Daoling, who is said to have created the first elixir of immortality at Mount Longhu, or Dragon Tiger Mountain, after which a dragon and a tiger appeared. Ge Hong, a prominent Taoist philosopher and alchemist during the 6th Dynasties period, wrote out extensive recipes for elixirs for immortality in the book, wrote out extensive recipes for elixirs for immortality. And when commenting on the necessity for the mixing and taking of elixirs to become immortal, Ge wrote that taking the divine elixir will produce an interminable longevity and make one co-eval with earth and sky. It lets one travel up and down in paradise, riding clouds and driving dragons. Thus, depending on the context, paintings of dragons as vehicles of Taoist immortals, or as flying in the clouds on their own, can be considered as symbols of this yang, and by extension, Taoist immortality. And in the history of Confucianism, the dragon motif has served as a metaphor for the great man. Lao Tzu is said to have been at one time the scholar in charge of the calendar and archives of the court of the Zhou dynasty. The great historian Sima Qian records that it was during this time that Confucius once visited Lao Tzu and requested to learn more about ritual, to which Lao Tzu declined. Confucius's opinion of Lao Tzu, however, is reportedly was one of admiration, as implied from this comment of their first meeting. He wrote, "Birds, I know they can fly. Fish, I know they can swim. Wild beasts, I know they can run. For those that run, I can make traps. For those that swim, I can weave silk threads. And for those that fly, I can make arrows with a silk string attached to them. As for dragons, they're quite beyond me. By riding the wind and clouds, they soar to the skies. Today, I had an interview with Lao Tzu. He is indeed like a dragon." Furthermore, according to later legend, the birth of the great sage was preceded by the appearance of dragons. Marinus Visser recounts that on the night of Confucius's birth, 2 azure dragons were recorded to have descended from the sky and came to his mother's house. After seeing them in her dream, she gave birth to Confucius. These are the legendary tales. This happens a lot also with the stories foretelling the birth of great people, particularly Chinese emperors. In fact, the Chinese dragon was incorporated into several major different roles and held many meetings within each philosophical school, further illustrating the symbol's fluidity within Chinese history and culture. So in Buddhism, we find the presence of dragons, originally Nagas at the Buddha's birth, and the development of the concept of the Buddhist dragon king. The Chinese word for dragons, or long, was used to translate Naga, a serpent-like creature in early Indian mythology, in Chinese Buddhist ritual literature as early as in the Han Dynasty. And this resulted in a conflation of the Chinese dragon and Indian Naga, or Sanskrit for cobra. A cursory review of a selection of encyclopedias and dictionaries of Buddhist terminology today continue to show the term Naga as being defined as a dragon. In Indian Buddhist cosmology, Nagas appear in the Pali Canon, described as semi-divine serpents who reside with their retinues in luxurious palaces at the bottom of the sea or in rivers and lakes. Visual representations of nāgarājas or Naga kings are frequently found at Indian Buddhist temples as part human and part snake. With the spread of Buddhism in China, Korea, and Japan, many stories which originated as stories featuring Nagas became about dragons. In Mahayana Buddhist literature, Nagas play an important role as protectors of sutras and as guardians of the Buddha and Buddhist relics. According to the Lalita Vistara Sutra, a Sanskrit Buddhist sutra dated to sometime in the 3rd century, shortly after the historical Buddha Shakyamuni achieved enlightenment, he visited Lake Mukalinda, a lake inhabited by a nāgarāja of the same name. This is an example of, again, a Naga king and his queen in stone from Ajanta. So in Lake Mukalinda, the Buddha wandered to various places for meditation. 1 week of meditation is spent beneath the tree of the Nāgarāja, Mukalinda. While the Buddha was sitting under this tree, wind and rain arose. At this, the Nāgarāja came from his abode and coiled himself around the Buddha 7 times, spreading his hood over the Blessed One's head. I wanted to share, I added this image of this drum slab from the British Museum as a reference point. You can see this is an example, a visual example of the story where close up in the center you see the Buddha meditating, and he is protected by the Mukalinda, with the cobra, 7-headed cobra head overhead. Chinese records of travels to India by Chinese Buddhist monks demonstrate how Naga was translated with dragon. In James Leger's translation of the Chinese monks Faxian's narratives of his travels to India from 399 to 414 CE, Faxian relates the legend of the historical Shakyamuni's birth when describing famous sites around the city of Kapilavastu. 50 lei east from the city was a garden named Lumbini, where the queen entered the pond and bathed. Having come forth from the pond on the northern bank, after walking 20 paces, she lifted up her hand, laid hold of a branch of a tree, and with her face to the east, gave birth to the heir apparent. When he fell to the ground, he immediately walked 7 paces. 2 dragon kings appeared and washed his body. At the place where they did so, there was immediately formed a well, and from it, a well as as well as from the above pond where the queen bathed. The monks even now constantly take the water and drink it. I'm including here this panel also from the British Museum, and it's a stupa panel, and it's showing here 3 scenes, which is showing the birth, where you can see in the center the mother, Queen Maya, giving birth above, and then you see down below the Buddha is being bathed. And what's interesting is that the representation of the Dragon King is not that of Nagas, which are usually depicted with like maybe a human body or cobra head or a cobra body of any kind. Actually, they're both portrayed as human, as totally human. So in these stories early on, the Nagas were translated and equated with the Chinese dragon, and in this case, Dragon Kings. The 2 Dragon Kings that appear to wash the Buddha's body are actually 2 specific Dragon Kings, Nanda and Upananda. Furthermore, Nagas were also understood as protectors of Buddhist relics. And in Leje's translation of the Chinese monk Faxian's accounts of his travels to India, Faxian describes the kingdom of Rama located between Kapilavastu and Kusinagara. The king of this country, having obtained one portion of the relics of the Buddha's body, returned with it and built over it a tope, named the Rama tope. By the side of it there was a pool, and in the pool the dragon, which constantly kept watch over the tope and presented offerings to it day and night. When King Ashoka came forth into the world, he wished to destroy the 8 topes over the relics and to build instead of them 84,000 topes. Topes meaning stupas, I think you guys have figured that. After he had thrown down the 7 others, he wished next to destroy this one, but then the dragon showed itself, took the king into its palace, and when he had seen all the things provided for offerings, it said to him, if you are able with your offerings to exceed these, you can destroy the tope and take it all away. I will not contend with you. The king, however, knew that such appliances for offerings were not to be had anywhere in the world, and thereupon returned, without carrying out his purpose. So in this passage, King Ashoka's riches and offerings for the Buddha's relics could not compare with the Naga king's luxurious palace and rich offerings. Thus, Ashoka acquiesces. So in addition to serving as staunch protectors of the Buddha and the Buddha's relics, Indian Naga, like the Chinese dragon, were also famously understood to have the beneficent ability to bestow rain. Marinus Visser attributes the original connections of Nagas as bringers of rain with the Mahayana Buddhist school, where they become fearful of the Buddha's law and therefore beneficent to mankind. And as we've already discussed, many pre-Buddhist historical sources have connected the appearance of Chinese dragons with rainfall, and therefore we find numerous Dragon King or Longwang tales that have emerged, in which it was believed that every water source was reigned over by different Dragon Kings with various powers, similar to that of nāgarājas, and they thus become worshipped as important deities. However, in contrast to the Indian Naga, which were understood as being half human and half snake, as an imaginary creature, Chinese dragons' early morphology lacked such specificity and representation. We find in the late Shang dynasty and Western Zhou dynasty, we find small nephrite pendants with metamorphosizing dragon motifs, notably where a dragon's tail ends in a bird's head, or where fowl turns into a fish, or a dragon or a human, or vice versa. And this further, again, emphasizes the dragon's early understanding and early and flexible morphology. This is an example of a pendant that's in the collection at Harvard Art Museums. And we see an example here where this is actually a composite creature. We have a head of a dragon with a large bird as its tail, clutching a curled worm or a snake. And then 2 holes were drilled at the top for suspending the plaque. So likely it was the bottommost component of a pendant set. In the early 2nd century, the Chinese dictionary of Suowen Jiezi, explaining and analyzing characters, compiled by the Han Dynasty scholar Xu Zhen, the dragon is described as the chief of all scaled reptiles. It is sometimes dark, it is sometimes bright, it is sometimes small, it is sometimes big, it is sometimes short, it is sometimes long. It ascends to heaven at the spring equinox and dives into the water at the autumn equinox. So that's really specific, right? that's really clear. Thus, the physical form of the dragon varied widely and could not be identified as being a specific animal of the real world. Therefore, the term was applied very flexibly to a variety of animal motifs. And the specific visual appearance of dragons was first described in a text in the Han Dynasty, so in the 2nd century, who standardized the physical features of the Chinese dragon as being called the 3 joints and the 9 resemblances. Wang Fu says, the people paint the dragon's shape with a horse's head and snake's tail. Further, there are expressions as 3 joints and 9 resemblances of the dragon, to wit, from head to shoulder, from shoulder to breast, from breast to tail, these are the joints. As to the 9 resemblances, they are the following. His horns resemble those of a stag, his head that of a camel, his eyes those of a demon, his neck that of a snake, his belly that of a clam, his scales those of a carp, his claws those of an eagle, his soles those of a tiger, his ears those of a cow, and upon his head he has a thing like a broad eminence or a big bump, which is called a chimu. If a dragon has no chimu, he cannot ascend the sky. Dragons that differed in appearance from these 3 joints and 9 resemblances were later further categorized into subcategories or as being quasi-dragons. Yinglong, or dragons with wings, Lilong, dragons without horns, Panlong, dragons before ascending the sky, Feishe, flying snake dragons, Longyu, fish dragons, and Zhulong, fire candle or fire dragons. The history of dragon painters and painting in China is long and illustrious, and the origin of dragon painting is regarded to have begun with the mythical Emperor Fuxi's creation of the 8 trigrams, which I shared earlier. But even in the Song Dynasty, this was still understood. In Emperor Huizong's Xuanhe Huapu, the imperial painting catalog of the Xuanhe era, states simply that the chart emerged from the river, the characters out of the Luo River, and tortoise and dragon painting started to be seen in this time. The famous Tang Dynasty art connoisseur Zhang Yuanyuan, in his Lidai Minghua Ji, or Record of Famous Paintings in History, identifies Cao Buxing, sometimes known as Cao Fuxing, who was active in the 3rd century of the Wu Kingdom of the 3 Kingdoms period, as the first master of dragon painting. It is recorded that during a month of drought in this time of the Song Wendi, which was from 407 to 453, prayers to rain were performed with no result, until Cao's painting of dragons were arranged upon the water, resulting in 10 days of heavy rain. Unfortunately, no paintings by him exist for us to know how truly efficacious his works were. So during the Wei, Jing, Southern and Northern dynasties, or 6 Kingdoms period, artists who were noted as great dragon painters included famous figures such as Gu Kaizhi and Zhang Xinyu. Gu Kaizhi is well known as a master of painter and drawer and writer, and is particularly noted for excelling at painting figures and portraits, and for his ability to capture a person's true likeness. Gu's paintings today are known mainly through later copies, such as Wise and Benevolent Women in the Palace Museum in Beijing, and Admonitions of the Court Instructress to the Palace Ladies, also in the British Museum. Gu's painting of individual dragons apparently do not survive. However, we can gather a sense of his fine painted lines from other scrolls attributed to him, such as in this detail from the long hand scroll Nymph of the Luo River in the first Sackler, most likely from the Southern Song period. The scroll illustrates a poem written by Cao Zhi, which tells the tale of a love story between a poet and the nymph. The opening scene illustrates the poet standing on the riverbank, meeting the nymph on the waves, and she is later shown accompanied by several divine animals and seated in a chariot drawn by 6 dragons. The dragons are elongated and delineated with fine, even lines as they soar and leap within the sky, reminiscent of the manner in which Gu famously portrayed female figures. Gu is well known for his particular employment of a silkworm line, a thin, unmodulated, tensile line like the gossamer thread spun by a silkworm, for defining individual figures in his paintings. When considering the Song Dynasty copy above, as you see here, the copyist similarly employed a thin, even line to illustrate the nymph and to outline each of the 6 dragons that pull her chariot. Thus, we're able to gain a sense of what Gu's original dragon painting style might have looked like. Zhang Xianyou's talent for painting dragons is highlighted in the idiom, 画龙点睛. To bring a painted dragon to life is by adding vitality to its eyes, which is based on a legend of when Zhang once painted 4 dragons on the walls of Anle Temple in Jingling. It is said that onlookers were puzzled when they saw that he had not painted the eyes of the dragons he just painted. He explained that if he painted the eyes, the dragons would fly away. People did not believe him and urged him to paint the eyes. When he added the eyes to 2 of the 2 dragons suddenly flew to a sky filled with thunder and lightning. The other 2 dragons without eyes remained on the wall. So in the early Song dynasty, successful dragon paintings demonstrated Wang Fu's 3 joints and 9 resemblances. And so to be skilled at painting dragons was considered a very difficult feat, for one must be able to balance this proper brushwork with an imagined creature's transformative and divine spirit. And as the Yuan dynasty art critic Tang Ho observed in the Hua Jian, or Mirror of Painting, he mentions the difficulty of painting dragons in general. One has to distinguish the spirit of horses in viewing horse paintings, and one has to recognize the transformations of dragons in dragon paintings. Therefore, dragon and horse paintings are most difficult. However, if one mainly focuses on the transformations of a dragon's emergence, the brushwork would become reckless ink play and lack painting discipline. If one was restricted by the painting method, then the idea of transformation is lost. Therefore, painting dragons is especially difficult. Therefore, with the roles of Chinese dragon and Naga at times conflated and functioning similarly, how did the artists then reconcile the Chinese idea of a dragon and the Indian Buddhist idea of Naga visually? Sources that focus specifically on the visual representation of dragon kings and their various transformations within a Buddhist context in the Chinese artistic tradition are limited, as the dragon king was not a traditional subject category in Chinese painting. An example of an early visual depiction specifically of a dragon king is found in the painting Long Hand Scroll of Buddhist Images by Zhang Xianyou, who was active from 1163 to 1189, a painter from the Song Kingdom of Dali, now in present-day Yunnan province. The scroll was painted during the Li Chen period for Duan Zixing, a ruler of the Dali kingdom, and it measures to up to about 53 feet long. The hand scroll begins with an imperial procession, followed by numerous Buddhist images that include dragon kings and arhats, 20 Avalokiteshvaras of various types, and the 6 patriarchs of the Chan school of Buddhism, as well as depictions of several Dali monks and laymen. In his study of the scroll, Li Lingzan compared Zhang's original scroll to a later Qing dynasty copy of it by the court painter Ding Wanpeng, as commissioned by the Qianlong Emperor. Zhang's rendering of the dragon kings, here, we see Upananda and Sagara bear striking resemblance to existing Indian representations of nāgarāja, with its depiction of hood of cobras, a reflection of the established Indian artistic convention. Yet interestingly, it is Nanda and Upananda who were the dragon kings identified present at the historical Buddhist birth, which we have just talked about. And we're seeing the differences looking at Nanda and Upananda. And then at the same time in this scroll, when not all the dragon kings are rendered in the same manner, as seen in Zhang's depiction of the dragon king Vasuki. Here he is rendered completely in human form, but flanked by dragons and attendants with serpent-like creatures to sort of indicate who he is. Zhang continues to follow the artistic tradition, Indian artistic tradition later in the scroll in his representation of a 3-headed cobra-hooded female on the left, who Li identifies as a dragon princess. Zhu Yu, a skilled Yuan dynasty figure painter, so Yuan dynasty is following the Song, painted a representation of a dragon king as seen in his scroll, as seen in this album leaf, actually seen at the Dragon King's palace. Very little is known about this artist, and few paintings have been attributed to him. Zhu was a student of the Yuan figure painter Wang and worked at the imperial court in Beijing from 1312 to 1320. And in this painting, a regally dressed man with long white hair is shown greeting visitors at a palace gate. The man's royal status is indicated by the parasol which hovers over him, as well as his large group of attendant figures. Here, the Dragon King is portrayed in completely human form and dressed as a Chinese ruler. The only visual indication of his divine dragon status are the representation of two of his attendants who appear to be rendered with dragon-like creatures. You can see right behind him, the two who are holding the parasol. So the fact that this palace, and we know that we are underwater because his palace is clearly shown to be underwater beneath rolling waves. Painted representations of dragon kings are found or alluded to in greater numbers dated to the Ming Dynasty in connection with representations of Lohans. The worship of Lohans, known as Arhats in Sanskrit, originated in India, and Lohans are said to embody faculties of wisdom and knowledge far superior to common mortals, with the power to perform impossible feats. With paintings of Arhats effortlessly crossing the sea are common, less common are painted representations of their destinations when traveling, particularly to the palace of the Dragon King. I include this image, a painting by Lu Linjia. This is just one scene of an album of several. I wanted to include it because it shows this Arhat who is clearly taming a dragon. Dated to 1587, Yo Cho's painted monochromatic hand scroll, Lohans Crossing the Sea, formerly in the Marilyn and Roy Papp collection in Phoenix, Arizona, is an example of such a display where Lohans and mythical creatures travel across water to pay a visit to the Dragon King. Yo Cho was born and trained in Suzhou and was the student and son-in-law of Zhou Ying, a noted professional painter, also recognized for his depictions of Buddhist subjects. While versed in various styles, Yo Cho is particularly known for his treatment of figures in landscape and his depictions of ancient legends, in addition to Buddhist motifs. Towards the end of this scroll, this particular scroll here, we see We see four courtly ladies stand before the gates of the Dragon King's palace. And now we see, if you go forward, a depiction of the Dragon King emerging from the sea in order to greet the traveling Lohans, dressed in a Chinese robe and covered in scales. And this is a better, closer detail. So you can see this is, again, clearly the Dragon King as part human, part dragon. But again, the question is, what is a dragon exactly? And then we're starting to see that right behind him in the scene, we see the women right before the palace gates. And we can only assume then that these women are guessed to be dragon princesses. And I just have some details here of this as well. And you can kind of tell she is a dragon princess in a way with the way she's dressed. Chen Hongshou was a famous painter, calligrapher, and designer of woodblock prints, active during the late Ming period. And he is perhaps best known and admired for his whimsically distorted representations of figures and for his attention to minute details. In his painted hanging scroll, the Dragon King revering the Buddha in the Fürsackler, hieratic scale is used to portray the Buddha's prominence over the Dragon King. The Dragon King is depicted with a dragon face and a human silhouette. Arms are clasped upward as in a form of respect, fully clothed in contemporary Ming period dress. And when comparing Yo Cho's and Chen Hongshou's depictions of dragon kings to earlier ones, no longer are we reminded of previous Indian representations. The Dragon King is now depicted with a dragon face, flying whiskers, flaring nostrils, bulging eyes, in visual contrast to the conservative regal costume. This brief overview of Chinese dragons and dragon kings is still only a beginning study, as many more ancient sculptural representations of dragon kings have not been addressed, nor dragon king altar images, dragon king temple architecture, as well as the contemporary worship of local dragon kings within Chinese culture today. With the transmission of Buddhist thought from India to China, representations of dragon kings appear to have transformed over time from an Indian artistic tradition of serpent-like representation into that of a distinctly Chinese style. This case study is an example of how significant Buddhist visual iconography was imagined, interpreted, adopted, and transformed over time as one of many cultural products of Buddhist transmission and exchange. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline, so much. I invite everyone to, we have about 15 or 20 minutes even for conversation and questions. I invite everyone to turn on their cameras. And if you have a question, to simply turn on your mic and leap in. I think Megan, I think you raised a hand. No, okay, just waving.
It's okay.
Any questions? You're also welcome to type a question in the chat, which I will read to Jacqueline aloud. Jacqueline, I was really struck by this, by the 8th century text that you talked about earlier on, this story of the painter who is charged with painting a dragon, which then in turn brings about rain. And it strikes me that it's this confluence of different kinds of agency, you know, the artistic agency and the agency of this divine creature, and the agency of nature. So I'm wondering, and there are a couple of other cases that got me thinking too. I'm wondering to what extent dragons become figures for the powers, but also dangers of artistic creation.
That's a great question. The dangers, that's a great word.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because, you know, we don't have evidence of so many of these kind of legendary, iconic artists that we celebrate so much in Chinese history and culture. And the way that they're, you know, all we have are these textual sort of compendiums and historical texts which record these things happening, that this so-and-so great artist painted this thing and it caused rain, or the building crashed, or, you know, again, it was like this fantastic event, and it just really just, you know, showcased how amazing this artist was, and you should have seen it, you know. So I do think that it's hard to say what is real in terms of what, if it actually happened, or if these are all exaggerations. And that's what I find so fascinating about so much of this research, and what's kept me motivated with it, is because of there's so many questions, you know, when you're thinking about, well, how do we even know how good a dragon painting really is? We don't really know what a dragon looks like. How closely is it actually, you know, what are we talking about here? You know, these dragons are these mythical composite creatures, never been seen by the naked eye. How do we know, how do we all recognize it?
Well, in fact, that 2nd century dictionary, they kind of back themselves into a corner with the kind of possibility and impossibility of dragons.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And that monstrous aspect too, you know, that it's a creature, it's an imaginary creature that draws parts from various actual observable creatures. You know, might have something to do with powers and risks of creation and imagination and invention.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Anyone else?
I did have a question. So in our class that we took this summer with Dr. Alibi, I was researching about Nagas in the Sahel area and the mythology of it, with the rulers there where they would wear the crown and kind of think about that, which I thought was very interesting. And then to have that be the same word, you know, as you're going east, which I just thought was very interesting. Do you think that there is any connection between the ideas of power? And I guess the other thing I thought about too was how the snake dragon imagery can be a force for good or power or healing in, you know, some mythologies, but in the very Western European it's you know, punishment for Eve, you know, it's poison, it's all these other symbols, and it's very opposite to these other cultures, the way they're taking it. So I didn't know if you thought there might be some kind of connection in the way it was traveling, the story and the mythology.
Yeah, no, yeah, you bring up a few things. It is interesting to think about the understanding of dragons in, you know, in Chinese culture versus what it is in the West. You know, I think there's a tendency to be more fearful of the creature, and in Chinese culture, it is celebrated, it is worshipped, it is, you know, of course, dragons. It's interesting because depending on stories and textual literature, you know, you don't want to upset it, of course, and you know, he's still a very he, she, it, they are very, very powerful creatures that you do not want to upset. Clearly, they're temperamental in a way, but they are. But yes, they're just, there's a much more positive association, you know, with them. They are saviors. They bring rain and, you know, help ensure human survival. And so I do think it's interesting because I think that is why they chose to sort of decide. They just, you know, in the translation. So, you know, early on, you see this happen in the text where they just, you know, how do you explain Nagas? Nagas don't exist as a type of creature specifically separate from, like, you know, on its own in Chinese culture existing. And so they found a way to adapt it, and they just went and did a bold-faced translation to be Nagas because they're like, oh, Nagas they live in water sources. Oh, so do Chinese dragon. Oh, they must mean dragon, you know, and that's kind of just set the ball rolling. And now we have this incredible literature and field of imagery, you know, as a result,
Yeah.
which I thought was really interesting. But I think you're right also about power. I think that, you know, the association of the dragon becomes to be associated with rule, with the right to rule. That's where you start to see the dragon all over the emperor's body, all over the court, the palace. It's a way to just, again, symbolize authority. He is the son of a dragon, right?
Yeah, I love the way you can see how stories evolve and translate into, you know, like you said, finding a different, oh, this must mean this because it's not, you know, and using it to, I love that the fact that art and stories live. That's, I love this. This is a really good topic.
I think we have a question from Caroline Kim.
Oh,
yes,
okay.
hi. Hello, Dr. Chao. I'm sorry, my video is not working, but that's probably better for everyone. I had a question about, so, you know, as you're talking about Eastern dragon, you know, Chinese dragons are like water dragons, and Western dragons just being so different. And I wonder what more insight can we glean from that? Why is it depicted so differently? And why are they displayed on, you know, royal robes and places, and Western dragons are more?
Yeah, I don't, you know, I wish I was more of an expert on Western dragons and Western art, and they just seem so different. I haven't really, you know, it's because, you know, we find evidence of dragons since the Neolithic period in Chinese culture, in Neolithic burials. So this motif of this creature is always existed from, like, when we're talking about the earliest examples of talking about art history and Chinese art history. And so it's always been a presence of some kind. And so I don't know if that's the same case in early, say, European art, or, you know, I'm afraid I'm not an expert and I can't speak to that, but it's always been I think much more it's just always been celebrated and considered more on the auspicious and positive readings and interpretation than, I know, like, I think of dragons like in other stories, like in medieval times, where I remember reading about, you know, dragons attacking people or kidnapping princesses, or I think in early illuminated manuscripts, like they're kidnapping people, they're just doing lots of not great things. So I don't know where the separation is, and I don't think, and the representation of them are not the same always either. Now, I don't know if in Western literature there's a description and a breakdown of a physicality that is like, that's how you know versus what I was trying to find that information when I was doing my research on Chinese art, because I wanted to get to the earliest reference if I could, and just see where these things are coming from. And so that Wang Fu quote, that was really critical for thinking about this work and thinking about dragons, where they're describing every part, like the legs like this, the head like this, ears look like this. And I don't know if there's that kind of breakdown in any Western art history texts.
I don't know of any. Maybe
bestiaries of some kind, or
Mark does. Oh, well, bestiaries would be a place to look. I wouldn't be surprised if there are. I mean, often they're used, if a text refers to a serpent, often the dragon is used to figure the serpent, and usually a symbol of evil. So you think of the dragon and the princess in the story of St. George, but there are cases in which, and there are many, but there's one case in 15th century Naples, for example, in which we find the dragon body kind of ornamenting a drawing for a ceremonial ship, and we see kind of dragon wings ornamenting this kind of pageantry, this pageant armor that the king wore. So I don't know that it was, and he certainly wasn't using it to refer to evil or sin. So it's, I think that it would be interesting to trace the cases in which it seems to be adapted not as a manifestation of evil, but when it's adapted for kind of ornamental reasons, or reasons related to kingship. I mean, I think the link with kingship is really interesting. And what exactly is, I mean, what's the link? What's the mechanism that links the king and the dragon? And what does the dragon do for the king? I mean, is the dragon the source of power, or does he help the king harness nature, or how does that work?
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that, because I can't speak for, again, perhaps the European traditions, but definitely in China, absolutely, they are sort of serving as again, a symbol of, if you can tame a dragon, if they'll listen to you, if they will answer you, then that it signifies, it's proof that you have your right to rule. And that's why I shared that example in my text about, this shame that happens with that Qianlong emperor, and his, he writes about how that incident happened. There was a famine, people were hungry, not enough crops, and he felt incredible shame that he could not break the famine. And that his mother had to go and pray at the temple for him, and so to try and invoke the dragon to cause rainfall. So there's a lot of there's just suddenly the ability to be able to control the dragon to is very much in Chinese imperial rule. It is the mandate of heaven, and this idea that one must, the heavens will decide, if you are a righteous ruler, dragons included.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah.
I actually have a quick question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Austin, I didn't see your chat.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. I was gonna ask you if have you ever seen the dragon used in a contemporary or modern political context? Maybe from like Mao or the Communist Party in China. I would be interested to know if they'd ever used it in their imagery or propaganda or whatever.
That's really interesting. I would say no. I haven't. I mean, I definitely see, what's interesting, and I didn't really get into this as much. My dissertation was more on a specific dragon painter and his biography, and then this was all like the necessary research to sort of support the understanding of what this painter's contribution really was. So the dragon, and so there are so many examples of definitely contemporary artists who are absolutely referencing historical dragon paintings, including it in their works, adding it to their production. And that's a great example, but they're not necessarily, but in terms of having a government take the imagery in some way for a political purpose, I have seen commercial examples, a lot of things where, for example, my painting of the Nine Dragon scroll, a very famous scroll in the MFA Boston, I've seen stamps, I've seen car skins, I've seen, and this idea of like, drive an Audi and it's like a dragon, and there was like a lot of this kind of commercial play, but I haven't, and I think a lot of it, and some of it, I think perhaps has to do with, under like during the communist regime and perhaps in the more modern era, there is much more of an inclination towards thinking within the Confucian idea and less so using and referencing religious, perhaps folkloric imagery, because you are not supposed to be perhaps practicing that particular religion. The religion of the state is actually, you're supposed to believe in Mao, you're supposed to believe in Xi Jinping or the rulers. And so like they won't show imagery that's not real and that of the people and seen of the everyday and celebrating the everyday worker. You won't see like a dragon suddenly as a propaganda point. And it's like, it's part of the state philosophy. So it's a good question.
Really?
Yeah, I was just curious because in my research for Rakowitz, I learned a lot about Saddam Hussein and how he sort of connected his heritage to Assyrian and Babylonian mythologies and rulers and things like that. So, I mean, and that's not per se like a rare occurrence. A lot of rulers try and connect their lineage to powerful past figures. So
absolutely.
So yeah, I was just curious if anyone had ever done that, but I mean, I'll look into it.
I mean, it's possible like it might have happened. I just couldn't think of any particular images that come to mind in that way. But yeah, no, absolutely, it does happen in history. We still have we have the lineages still to the modern day of like the ancestors, the descendants of Confucius. They all still exist, and so it's really interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. Any other questions? If not, let's thank Jacqueline again.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll do our clapping. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And next week, we have our next workshop talk by Bonnie Pittman, who's Distinguished Scholar in Residence at UT Dallas. And the title of her talk is Artists' Response in a Pandemic, COVID-19 and Influenza 1918. She'll be talking about how contemporary artists are now responding to and have in the past responded to pandemics. So we look forward to joining you, to welcoming you then. And thank you again, Jacqueline.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here.
Okay, thanks. Be well.